Australia, and what Scott Morrison's presence at the G7 summit has managed to do is to remind China, and for that matter, remind the world, that when push comes to shove, the liberal democracies of the world will work together and will stay together. And so, as a message of consolidation of the liberal democratic and market-based societies, this G7 summit was particularly timely, and it does send a strong message to China in particular, but also Russia, Iran, and so on, those authoritarian societies, that they're not going to be able to change the status quo and abandon the rules-based international system and change the world without there being huge resistance from the liberal democracies.
Nikki, where do you think this positions Australia? Alexander here is saying that, you know, like Scott Morrison has had some influence and in terms of what he wants to have heard and done as a show of solidarity when it comes to China. What's your view?
Yeah, look, Australia is a side player in this. You know, yes, we are important. Our relationship with the US and the UK is important, but we are still a small country, a small, relatively, economy in the world, and, you know, we take the lead from others. I think, you know, the rules-based order, which the Prime Minister and others are talking about at the moment, it's problematic for Australia because we have so many economic eggs in China's basket, and, you know, we can be held over a barrel, as we have been in the last year. Fortunately, we've managed to move a few things, and obviously iron ore prices are still very high, so our net exports are looking okay. But we are in a difficult position, and the last thing we want to do is to escalate this situation to the point where we actually are talking seriously about war. There's been a bit of posturing on that. So this is a very difficult situation for us. It's good for Australia to show that it is aligned with others, but I think when, you know, talk is one thing, there's rhetoric there, but I think there's a very difficult problem for us to solve, and it won't be an easy one.
So what was accomplished at the summit? Well, when it comes to the biggest issue facing the world at the moment, coronavirus, the G7 have pledged 1 billion vaccine doses for the world's poorest nations. Now, of that, 500 million will come from the US. Australia will provide 20 million doses. Now, it sounds like a lot, but the plan has been roundly criticised by international bodies, health campaigners, and even the UN.
To defeat the virus and to be able to boost our weapons against the virus, and the most important of those weapons is vaccination. To boost those weapons, we need to act with the logic, with the sense of urgency, and with the priorities of a war economy. And we are still far from getting there.
And according to UNSW epidemiologist and WHO advisor Mary Louise McLaws, it's a drop in a very big ocean and not a serious start.
I'm not sure why they've stopped at a cap of 1 billion, considering that the G7 represents the wealth of the world. That is pocket money to them. It doesn't even cover those that live in extreme poverty. There are about 2 billion people in the world. That certainly doesn't cover even the low, not the extreme poverty, but low income or middle income countries. Because America has tried to get the IP held and the Europeans are obstructive, it means that low or middle income countries can't develop their own resources to help themselves. And they don't always want to take from the high income countries. They want to be able to do this themselves. 2.4 billion doses have been given out in people's arms so far. So that leaves 9.4 billion doses to do everybody. But if we're going to be looking at just 80% as a coverage rate, we're still 7 billion doses short. So it's a long way to go. And if we have a look at the speed at which America and the UK and Israel were able to ramp up, mostly the US took 8 to 9 weeks to get to their top level of distributing the vaccine into everyone's arms. If you take that level, it would still take the rest of the world a couple of years to get vaccinated. So aiming for 2022 is incredibly ambitious.
Amy, 1 billion, is this enough?
Well, I mean, I think just to listen to Mary-Louise McLaws there, it's very evident that it's nowhere near enough. It's a drop in the ocean. So I understand that about 4 billion people will be reliant on the COVAX facility, which is the facility that's distributing these vaccines to low and middle income countries. 4 billion people will be reliant on that. If you're talking about double doses, you know, many of these regimens require 2, so you're actually talking about 8 billion doses, 1 billion. You've got to look at the small print of this as well. So these countries have said, we will endeavour to get the first 500 million doses out, you know, promptly, and then it's going to be over the course of a year that we're going to distribute this billion doses. And I mean, let's all think back to where we were a year ago. Like, anything can happen in coronavirus within the space of 12 months. So it's very slow. It's too little too late, I think. And I also think it completely just underscores this kind of status quo that's created this problem, this inequity. So the G7 nations account for 28% of all the doses that have been administered so far in the world, compared to 0.3% in developing countries. And the G7 nations are the ones who have hoarded many times over the amount of vaccines that they actually need to cover their population. And now they're turning around and saying, oh, well, you know, we've essentially got ours, and now you can have the scraps, the leftovers. Like, the point is that we need to be ramping up production facility. We need to be lifting, as was just said in that segment, the intellectual property to allow these countries to ramp up production and to do it like on home soil. These are the things that really need to happen. Like, we need a paradigm shift. It's not enough to just say, oh, yes, we'll pledge, you know, whatever's left over from what we've already done to vaccinate our own population. So, yeah, I don't think it goes far enough.
Yeah, Ali, why wouldn't we waive the patent rights here? The US is supporting it.
I think we should. I think patent rights on something so important for the world right now is, to be honest, almost criminal and inhumane. I mean, you know, a lot of people around the world are suffering, predominantly in the low and poor countries. And if we are going to hold on to the patents, which, let's be honest, are developed by the taxpayers' funding, because a lot of these organizations which have come up with vaccines are funded heavily by the taxpayers' money and the government. So I think the patent should be waived, and countries should be allowed to manufacture. But if I may, I want to connect both topics together. When you initially talked about China and competition with China and geopolitical dominance, China is supplying vaccines to a lot of countries around the world, and if liberal democracies are going to win this geopolitical conflict, if not a Cold War, then we need to really pull ourselves together and help people where we can. Otherwise, we'll lose out.
No, I think this is meant to be, those billion is kind of meant to be a flagging of that. Now, Alexander, can we bring you in here on the question of patents, as well as the question of, look, Australia's entered into separate agreements to secure more than 195 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines. It's far more than we'll need. Should we be giving more than 20 million here?
Yeah, these are contracts. These are not the actual doses that exist and are being stored at the moment. So I think there are a lot of issues that have been raised and discussed here. First of all, nobody said that the G7 would distribute 1 billion, and when they got to the 1 billionth vaccine, they would not distribute any more. This is just setting themselves a bit of a target for the short term. I noticed Boris Johnson saying the aim was to get the whole world vaccinated by the end of next year. I mean, imagine in countries which have very poor distribution, problems with storage, anti-vax campaigns. There's much more resistance to vaccination in some parts of the world than in others. None of this is easy. You shouldn't overestimate it. Nobody wants to stop the distribution of vaccines. Everybody agrees that we want the world vaccinated. And as for the patent issue, well, I'm advised whatever the rights or wrongs of the different positions, the American position versus the European position, it's very difficult to manufacture the vaccine. And so it's not as though, you know, in Malawi or Burkina Faso or Ecuador, they're just waiting to start producing and just aren't able to do it for some legal reason. It's not possible. It's very, very complex to produce it. And I think that's much more of a legal issue than a practical issue.
Although I think the question is, in those countries which are able to, should we be waiving it?
Yeah, but so a country like India is... I think I'm right in saying India produces the largest number of vaccines of any country. So India has already a facility to produce a and the capacity to produce the vaccines. I mean, and for example, the list of countries that I just mentioned, if you take Malawi, vaccines have been sent to Malawi and they had to destroy the vaccines because of the difficulties they have with the distribution and getting people to accept being vaccinated. So, this is not a simple issue. It's incredibly difficult. And all you can say is, we're just criticising for the sake of criticising these 7 leaders, so the 9 if you include the EU.
No, we're not. The people aren't criticising, but we're attempting to understand, in part, why other people have been so critical.
I'm filled with ambition to get to the end of my sentence.
Yeah.
These leaders are full of goodwill and they want the world to be vaccinated. It's not so they don't want the world to be vaccinated, but it's an extremely difficult and complex thing to do. So we just need to think it through a bit.
Nikki.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Alexander. I think, this is the 1 billion isn't the end of the line, and it is in everybody's interests to get as much of the world vaccinated as possible. I mean, patents are difficult things, I understand, but we haven't even managed to get facilities up and running in Australia yet. So I take that point that you can't have it everywhere. The main thing is, wherever it's manufactured, it sounds to me more like for developing economies, what we need to be doing is making sure that we not only send vaccines, but we send people out there as well who can make sure that the supply chains are kept intact and that there are people there to help distribute and vaccinate as much as possible. You've got organisations like Médecins Sans Frontières that are right around the world already that could potentially help. So let's engage all of those people, because we want, if we want the world to open back up again. It's in everybody's interest to do so. So I don't think anyone's sitting on this trying not to distribute it.
Right. Is it? Yes, Ali, yes.
Julia, if I just quickly jump in, it's not just about how many doses we produce, but it's also about how quickly we produce them. So the countries which have the facilities to manufacture and produce, if we are to work with them and take the IP barrier out, and I know there's a lot of complexities, I agree with Alexander that there's plenty of complexities, but if more people are manufacturing more vaccines, we'll manufacture a large number of vaccines much faster. And I think that's what we're trying to argue, and without rejecting the argument that there is complexities and there are issues of storage and distribution in some countries.
Isn't it also the case, Nikki, that we are talking about a long history of developed countries looking after their own interests first, and knowing that in a pandemic that the urgency of it, it's humanitarian grounds, it's the right thing to do ethically, all those kinds of things, but actually to have borders open and be comfortable, we have to be conscious that we don't continue a bias of just looking after ourselves.
But it's pretty natural, isn't it? I mean, politically, it'd be very hard for any Prime Minister or President to say, we're shipping all these millions. Can you imagine if Australia says, well, I know we've sent some to Papua New Guinea, and quite rightly, but if we're saying we're sending hundreds of millions of doses around the world, and we haven't got our own
people wouldn't
population
care
vaccinated.
if we were vaccinated.
And that's the thing. So everyone quite rightly wants to see their own populations. I mean, that's just natural for politicians to want to do it, and for their electorate to want, their people to want that to happen. And I think once they feel that they're getting up to these higher levels of vaccination, which clearly they are in the US and the UK, then they can say, all right, we've got this under control. We know what we're doing. We've got the doses. Now we can send them out to everybody else and get this show on the road. But it's unrealistic to think that
Well, but think about it. The majority of high-income countries have secured, this is according to UNICEF, at least 350% of the doses they need.
But they don't necessarily have those doses right now and right here and now. And you don't want to send 8 billion out right now.
Without accounting for vaccines that they've optioned but are yet to be released.
Well, I think you can't just dump 8 billion on the world and think that they're all going to get done. So I've got no problem with timing as long as there is a strategy to keep going. And, I think as we've all said, it's in everybody's interest to do this. We want the world to be as normal as possible, as quickly as possible. So I don't think anybody's deliberately standing in the way of this. They may well have put their own populations first.
No, it's not about deliberate. It's just about being conscious of what are our humanitarian and global obligations. It's something we all should be talking about.
They're conscious.
No, it's not about. But how? But should we not continue to be conscious and continue to discuss it and continue to say our neighbours must also be part of our thinking? It's not. It's just a question of challenging complacency around it.
Everybody is saying that. and a huge amount is being done. I mean, the biggest problem is the production and distribution of the vaccines. This takes time. You have to have the right environment. They can only be distributed at a certain temperature and so on. And when you get into some developing countries, it's incredibly complicated and difficult to do that. But everybody knows this, and they're doing their best. And it inevitably will take time. I think there's one other issue, and that is that in some parts of the world, there's quite a lot of resistance to being vaccinated. If you like, political resistance, and that is going to be a long-term problem. I mean, you've seen that, including in the UK, where I am, in some of the ethnic communities here in the UK, there's resistance to vaccinations, so it's going to be a problem.
But you're right, the last thing you want is for all of the developed world to have their vaccines, and 12 months' time we just go, oh, we're fine, do not worry about anyone else. But I don't see that as a risk at the moment, so...
All right, a decision on the future of a Tamil family who've been fighting deportation from Australia since 2018 is expected within days, amid growing community anger over their treatment. It comes a week after the youngest daughter, Tanika, was medevaced to Perth from Christmas Island, suffering from pneumonia and sepsis. She was accompanied by her mother, Priya, but her father and older sister remain on Christmas Island. The acting Prime Minister, Michael McCormack, says the family may be reunited in Perth and a decision about their immediate future will be made in the coming days.
We are all compassionate, whether we're in Parliament and whether we're not, and I appreciate that many people have a view on this matter, but we will decide our view through Alex Hawke as the Minister with the proper oversight of this decision. He will make that announcement this week, and he will base it on humanitarian considerations, on health outcomes and on legal advice.
In the last week, a number of Coalition MPs have broken ranks, calling for urgent ministerial intervention on the matter.
Tanika and Kapika were born in Australia, Now, maybe if their names were Jane and Sally and they were playing the local netball side, would think twice about sending them back to another country which they're not from. I mean, send them to Sri Lanka. Why not send them to Southern Sudan? Send them to Rwanda. Send them to Belarus, because they're also countries they're never born in.
But when asked about their future on the sidelines of the G7 meeting in Cornwall yesterday, the Prime Minister appeared firm in his view that they're not eligible for permanent settlement.
Settled, well, that wouldn't be government policy for a pathway to permanent settlement. That is not the government's policy. There are options that are being considered that are consistent with both health advice and the humanitarian need and the government's policy.
Alexander, didn't the Howard government, which you were part of, agree some 16 years ago to get children permanently out of detention?
Well, yeah, we wanted to get children. I mean, again, obviously people would want to get children out of detention, but you have to run an immigration policy, and this is never easy, I can tell you from long experience. You put in place a policy, you say people can come to Australia in certain circumstances. People come in other circumstances, claim to be refugees, are found not to be refugees. They are to be deported in those circumstances because they haven't followed the normal processes. And then when it gets to the deportation, then there can be these sorts of issues that arise. Some children born while they've been in detention and so on. These things arise, and ministers have discretion in order to deal with the circumstances of those cases. But you do have to have an immigration policy. I mean, the alternative is just completely open immigration. Anyone can come to Australia who wants from anywhere in the world, no matter what their circumstances.
But I doubt that discretion
I doubt that a country would ever have a policy like that. So if you're going to have a policy, you're going to have criteria for people to be able to come to Australia. If they don't meet those criteria, typically you would deport them. But as I say, you're about to say, I think that you need to have some element of ministerial discretion if the circumstances are very special circumstances, and that may or may not be the case here. I don't know enough about it.
And I have to say here that the ABC understands the federal government is understood to be on the verge of announcing a solution that would allow this family detained for several years on Christmas Island to live freely in Australia.
Oh, hooray.
Ali. Ali?
Yeah, Julia, I just think that, it's really hypocritical that, we talked about rule of law and international conventions, and now we're talking about having an immigration policy which literally ignores it. I mean, we cannot take everybody into the country. I know we can't have an open border policy, but we are bound by international conventions and rule of law to treat people well if they come as political refugees, give them enough protections while they're here, and do the assessments in a certain period of time which is humane. We have locked people here for decades, or almost close to decades. We have not assessed their cases. We put children in detention, and here we are talking about how great we are because we are liberal democracies and we follow a rule of law. So I find that hypocritical. And this family in particular, look, their case has been well known around the country. They're well loved in Biloela. The people in Biloela want them back. And I think the decision and the delay, the delays in decision is I think, appalling and close to inhumane.
Nikki, on the verge though, the government, ABC's understands the government is on the verge of announcing a solution that would allow them to live freely in Australia.
Well, hallelujah, but how long has it taken them to get there? And it's because this family has been, because of the plight they're in now, and because we are seeing those faces of those little girls, and the distress of this family is everywhere. What about all the other asylum seekers whose phones are taken away, who don't have that privilege? My own husband wrote to our local member a few days ago to say, I am outraged. And clearly, thousands and thousands of Australians are doing exactly the same thing.
And that's not something he normally does?
No,
Right.
not at all.
Yeah.
And so, and literally within 36 hours, I'm sure it wasn't just Pete's letter, but the email, the member for North Sydney was suddenly out there saying, I support their release. So, to me, it's political expediency. But to be honest, I actually don't care. The fact that they're doing something about this family is wonderful. But then you've got to say, well, what about all the others? Everyone has a right to seek asylum in this country. Yes. This, Priya Nades spent a decade trying to get out of war-torn Sri Lanka. I just ask any, Australian who many of us sit comfortably in middle-class Australia and have no idea what these people have been through. We absolutely must protect people. Of course we can't have open borders. No one's suggesting that at all. And I understand the immigration policy is tough, but this is genuine refugees that are trying to come to Australia with two little girls who were born in Australia and retrospectively declared not Australians, but maritime asylum seekers. I mean, just the lack of humanity, what we have put. Can you imagine putting two little girls through what we have put these kids through? I'm sorry, I'm so angry and I find myself crying in front of the news half the time, every time I see these little girls, because I have three daughters of my own, and I just think, I know that every politician has kids, and you shouldn't have to be a parent to understand, but boy, when you are, your heart is just aching for this family. It's not a hard decision. Just if they had quietly sorted it out a couple of years ago, instead of being so pig-headed about it, it all would have gone away. There's plenty of other ways to do it. And where are the boats, by the way? What's happening with that? Can we?
Amy, there'll be a lot of doctors who will be pleased with this decision because of the health concerns that have been repeatedly raised. Not just in this case, but the case of other people who've been in detention. I mean, should this be heralded as a moment of compassion, if that's the case, that they'll be allowed to live freely?
I mean, absolutely. I share the same sentiments. I think it's well overdue. It's incredibly welcome. Peter Harcher described it last week as gratuitous cruelty, and I couldn't agree more. I really think that this has gone well beyond any kind of political. The antecedents, as you've just said, of this policy no longer exist. I mean, where are the boats? The world is closed down from COVID. We're all looking inward and worrying about other things. So I think that's one thing. There's no political justification for this anymore, if there ever was, which I don't personally think there was. And I think the other observation to make is at what cost to these kids. I mean, we know that that detention is bad for your health, it's bad for your mental health, it's bad for your physical health. And for children in particular, in those formative years of their life, as these girls have been, spent locked up in a place very far remote from, all the normal things that they should be enjoying as children, going to school, being outside, living in their community that so desperately wants them to come home. I think, we should I feel an immense sense of relief that these girls may be allowed to return back to society, but I think we have done something irreparable to their development, and it is a burden that they will carry for the rest of their lives. This is why the medical community has been very outspoken about this in the past few days. The AMA, as several of the specialty colleges, including the RACP, which represents paediatricians, have come out really strongly saying, we've said this so many times. We've seen this so many times. Detention of children is never acceptable. It's never okay. Arbitrary, deprivation of liberty of anyone is not okay. But these children have not made any choices except they were just born, and to just... I really find this argument around, well, they were born here and so therefore we somehow owe them something more because they're Australian. They're human beings, and we should treat anyone, any child, any adult with the same compassion, respect, dignity as these girls have been deprived of.
Well, I look forward to seeing the celebrations in the town of Biloela when finally this family that they've embraced and have yearned for to return to them so much will be on the way. Now you're watching The Drum. With me on the panel are economics consultant at Social Outcomes and the Climate Council, Nikki Hutley; in Wodonga, junior doctor and editor at Croaky, Amy Coops; in Brisbane, CEO of the Islamic College of Brisbane, Ali Kadri; and in London, former Minister for Foreign Affairs, High Commissioner to the United Kingdom and Liberal Party leader Alexander Downer. An all-female panel will investigate whether there's a misogynistic and toxic culture for women and girls in swimming. It comes after swimmer and two-time Olympic silver medalist Maddie Groves withdrew from the Tokyo Olympics, making this statement.
Let this be a lesson to all misogynistic perverts in sport and their bootlickers. You can no longer exploit young women and girls, body shame or medically gaslight them, and then expect them to represent you so you can earn your annual bonus. Time's up. My decision is partly because there's a pandemic on, but mostly it's the culmination of years of witnessing and benefiting from a culture that relies on people ignoring bad behaviour to thrive. I need a break.
Swimming Australia has called on Ms Groves to take part in the investigation, with President Kieran Perkins telling the ABC last week that they'd repeatedly reached out to her with no success.
And unfortunately, at this point, we've not been able to have a direct conversation with Maddie to understand exactly what her concerns are, who the people involved are, so that we can investigate and deal with it. There is always going to be historical things that we need to acknowledge and work towards resolving. But I and I think everybody in our sport would certainly be quite challenged by the assertion that there is that misogynistic culture.
And all of this comes as Tasmanian researcher and former elite swimmer Dr Jenny McMahon released evidence from hundreds of swimmers and coaches who've witnessed or experienced humiliation and psychological abuse within the sport. She's heard how some athletes were forced to run 10 kilometres because they ate an ice cream, how some were criticised for the size of their breasts and bottoms, and how the repeated focus on swimmers' figures has resulted in a legacy of disordered eating for the athletes. And I'm pleased to say that Jenny McMahon joins us now. Welcome to The Drum.
Thank you for having me.
Now, much of this came from your own experience. You've witnessed this up close as a competitive swimmer. What was your experience?
Yeah, so I had quite a good experience in swimming until I made my first Australian team, and I was 15 years of age. My own coach wasn't travelling with me, and I was subjected to daily weigh-ins and skin folds every 5 days. I learnt what a calorie was. I had other swimmers and coaches monitoring what I ate. You know, I survived my first Australian team because I was a young girl that hadn't started developing. But then in my next Australian team, when I was 16, I still hadn't got my periods, but I was starting to develop and still subjected to the same daily weigh-ins, skin folds every 5 days. And unfortunately on that team, I had 3 consecutive weight increases. They were a point of a kilo. They were so minuscule. And the team manager of the Australian swimming team and a senior coach who would line us all up on pool deck with a clipboard and take our weights, you know, said to me, "We're worried about your weight increases. That shows us that you're not committed to the Australian swimming team. We'll be interested to see how your weight goes tomorrow. And if there's another weight increase, your place on the team will be revoked." Anyway, I was so upset and so anxious. So I went back to some of the senior girls because I was so upset because it's everything that I'd worked towards. And one of the senior girls taught me to throw up for the first time that night. And she said, you know, that's how we all manage our weight. So I tried. She motioned what to do and I did it. And not enough food came up. So I then went to the sauna and sat in the sauna for 3 hours. And that was like the night before my World Championship swim. So I don't know what that did to my performance. I didn't have another weight increase, but I, you know, yeah.
Has that had an ongoing impact on you?
Yeah, so like I've had disordered eating my entire life since I left the Australian team. So what I mean by disordered eating is I will take diet drugs and I will starve myself and then I'll really shred, or I'll go on like soup diets or starving and then I'll binge eat, or I'll take excessive laxatives. As also from my experiences, and like I've been addicted to prescription medication and alcohol as well. And, you know, I was unemployed for a long time and I went back to uni. I went to uni as a mature age and then worked my way up from there and have been researching the culture since 2007. And, you know, my experiences, I'm not alone in my experiences. There's many swimmers out there, both male and female, that have experienced this.
Yeah, and you conducted an enormous number of interviews. Did they tell you whether the culture has changed since your time? Is it still the same? Are there any parts that are worse? What's going on?
Well, there's things that I never experienced that are happening now. So, you know, I'm working with the International Olympic Committee at the moment with swimmers and coaches in Australia. So, like, I'm doing a project this year, so I'm up to date with things. And, like I never saw in my day young kids being ridiculed by their coach for not training hard and being called dogs and being told to get out and roll in the grass like dogs. Apparently a story has just come out of a young boy who was made to wear female swimmers because he was training like a girl. I never saw that, but I have in my research in the last 13 years been told that boys have been called girls for lack of training performances. But there's, you know, it's more than just body practices. There's other things like coach ignoring the athlete for lack of performance, yelling and screaming, excessive workloads for young children, not developmentally appropriate, and they're getting injured and sick.
So what do you think is shaping this culture? I mean, I'm sure many coaches would say, we just want to drive people hard. You know, the kids need to work hard and we want them to be, you know, at their fastest in the pool, and that means checking that they're really healthy. And is this about a drive to succeed? Is it a particular culture that's festered in swimming or in parts of swimming? Is it a lack of respect for women? What's going on?
I think there's two parts to that question. Firstly, that I don't condone that athletes need to work hard. They absolutely do, and that's not what I'm saying. But they, you know, if you look at psychological abuse, psychological research, there's nowhere that it will say that abusing an athlete will make them perform. So, you know, in your own experiences in work, if you're getting abused, you're not going to perform to capacity. So I'm not saying you can't work hard. I'm saying that you work hard in a safe environment. And the second part to the question about the performances is that, you know, if there's funding to Swimming Australia and other sporting organisations for their performances at the Olympics, and that places, you know, pressure on them, which places pressure on the coaches place pressure on the athletes. So, you know, from all the way up to the top. You know, and I've spoken to coaches too that have spoken out about these practices, and they've been unfortunately ostracised and isolated and haven't been able to make further teams. So, you know, and I've had so many just from today with my interviews, parents and coaches, sports psychologists reach out to me saying that they spoke out and nothing happened, or they were ostracised. So, you know, it's a real issue. They obviously feel safe coming to me, and they can feel safe coming to me, but me alone is not going to drive change.
Well, that's a significant cultural problem if people are ostracised when they speak up about this. Amy, does any of this surprise you?
Unfortunately, no. Like, I think it's a phenomenon in sport, but I find such parallels with this and like these kind of conversations that we have around other institutions. And so I think it's an institutional thing. I'm so reminded of what we've heard about what's happened in the Defence Force or other kind of very hierarchical institutions, including medicine. You know, like there's been a whole movement in recent years in medicine around sexism, bullying, discrimination, and this real kind of like power imbalances and hierarchy. I think it's not surprising at all, sadly. It's like a very male-controlled, still male-dominated sport. And there's an additional element in swimming that I think is interesting, different to some other sports, where there is this real fetishization of the body, and you know, these people perform like with barely any clothes on, and they are ogled, right? So I think there's this whole other element of it that's not probably the same as some other sports, where there's this emphasis perhaps on performance but less also on cosmesis. But I feel like there's an additional thing that comes into play here. Advertisers, you know, athletes are marketable, swimmers are incredibly marketable, right? So I think that's a whole other part of the conversation as well. Not surprising, very sad, very disturbing. Really think we need to like ventilate the dirty laundry here. Like, it would be great to have similar to like Human Rights Commission. They've had previous inquiries into these sorts of matters, and I think it would be well overdue to have one here.
Absolutely.
You're getting agreement on that one. Ali, where do we draw the line here between discipline and abuse?
I think, I've never played a competitive sport, but I do understand the importance of, being in the best shape and best performance. And I think I would agree with what somebody said earlier, that, I don't think abusing somebody psychologically or putting too much pressure on a person would necessarily produce good results. So I think, the line is where, the goal is achieved without harming human beings, because I think at the end of the day, the well-being and happiness is more important than a few gold medals or what you can win in the Olympics. And I think you can achieve a lot more if you are psychologically and physically happier and healthier.
Exactly.
Alexander, does this strike you as a culture that needs significant change?
I just don't know enough about it, in all honesty. I mean, in a sense, listening, it doesn't altogether surprise me, because I wouldn't have thought this was peculiar to swimming. But right across elite sports, if you want to be a winner, you have to invest a huge amount of time and suffer, I would imagine, great pain in order to be one of the best, not just to be good. I played tennis at school and university. You don't have to suffer to do that. But to become an elite sports person, I would have thought a fair bit of suffering and pain would go into that. So,
do you think abuse?
So Jenny's got a question for you.
Depends how you. I mean, I don't think obviously. I mean, because let's just try to state the bleeding obvious. Nobody's in favour of abuse. Here are questions that are being raised, which Swimming Australia, in the case of swimming, needs to investigate, and the evidence needs to be brought forward. But my only point is that I would have thought there was huge stress on elite athletes if they're going to win medals.
But Alexander, do you think sometimes that's maybe what has allowed these kind of cultures to form in some sports? As I say, you have to suffer. Yeah. It's tough, man.
Sure.
You've got to be mentally tough.
I mean, I'm guessing, right? But I don't, and I do know a number of people who've been very successful swimmers and sports people.
Well, there's also your own experience with tennis.
I think we might be getting carried away with ourselves there. My big point is that yes, they're under huge pressure to win, and of course, they want to win. I want to win a gold medal in the Olympic Games or whatever it is. They're under huge pressure to win, and the coaches are under pressure to help them win. And yeah, I would have thought it would be a vicious regime that they would have to go through. It doesn't surprise me.
Jenny, do you want to respond to any of that?
Yeah, so the International Olympic Committee put together a consensus statement back in 2016. So some of the things that I've touched on today are indeed abuse and should not be happening in sport. So I think that that Swimming Australia really needs to firstly sign up to the sport integrity framework. They are yet to do that as a sporting organisation, and they also need to initiate, like gymnastics, the Human Rights Commission, just so they can look at past and present practices to inform, future practices, so our athletes can undergo that gruelling training that Alexander's talking about, but that it's not abusive and that they can be safe when they're doing it.
It's so hard, Nikki, to imagine that not having a significant effect on you. Even just being an adolescent girl and the self-consciousness about your body and going through changes, I just can't even, imagine. And then you're on the world stage and you've got that scrutiny. How do we protect and mitigate against that? Or is this review part of that?
Well, obviously there needs to be a review, but it goes beyond swimming quite clearly. I mean, we've heard stories in gymnastics, for example. I mean, even in men's sports, when you think about the pressure that the Australian cricket team was under to the point where they felt they needed to cheat to win a game, I think, the pressure we put on these sports people is just completely ridiculous. And obviously they want to win, but because they are so driven, even more reason for them to be in that safe and protected space and not have their coaches actually add to that fear that's within them, to be protecting them and supporting that mental health. We're just creating a giant culture for people and what message does it send to our kids who are at school looking up to these these icons of sport and saying that this sort of behaviour is okay. I mean, to be the best in the world, what an incredible thing, but yes, amazing discipline, but at what cost? We really have to draw a line somewhere, but I suspect, it's not just the personal drive. Of course, there's a lot of money that sits behind all this and sponsorships, that we alluded to before. So there's clearly something rotten in this state that needs to be addressed, and there is a problem with culture around sport, I suspect.
And a lot of these athletes who've given us so much pleasure. Often, I mean, as Australian swimmers over the last few decades. Jenny, there is a review that's being underway by Swimming Australia. Are you content with that? And what would you like to see as a consequence of it?
I'm not content with it. I looked at the International Safe Sports recommendations of what constitutes independent, and it says some people with no association to the organisation, and Swimming Australia has come out and said that Tracy Stockwell is going to be leading that. She's a current director on the board of Swimming Australia. It needs to be a truly independent organisation, an independent review, and that, I'm not hopeful that they're going to get the job done.
And what would be, if you were sitting down before them, and aside from all the evidence that you've collected over the years about other people's testimony, what would you be saying they have to do?
I would be saying that they need to sign up to the Sport Integrity Framework, Australian Sport Integrity Framework, and they need to be proactive like Gymnastics Australia and conduct an independent review through the Australian Human Rights Commission. I wrote those notes down because I was getting all my words jumbled. But yeah, and I love the sport and I love the athletes, and there's some good coaches in there, and I'm not saying you don't have to work hard, but I'm saying that it needs to be safe, because some of these athletes are ending up with long-term health consequences because of some abusive coaching practices.
Right, which is what no one wants. Jenny McMahon, thank you so much for joining us tonight on The Drum. Great to chat.
Thank you, everyone.
Jenny McMahon is a Commonwealth Games gold medalist and a senior academic at the University of Tasmania. Now, if you've been affected by anything we've been discussing, call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or 1800 RESPECT on 1800 737 732. Now, most Australians grew up being taught that if they work hard, save money, cut down on the avocado toast, then one day they'll be able to buy a house. But new research shows that many now think that this dream is out of reach for our younger generations. The ABC's Australia Talks national survey has found that 65% of participants agreed that for most young people, owning a house just isn't an option. And when it came to young people today having a better or worse off life than their parents, only 22% thought they would have a better life and 59% said they would be worse off. How are we to read this, Nikki?
Well, it's hardly surprising. I mean, we have had a housing crisis in this country probably for 2 decades, and all levels of government hold responsibility for this. It's around local government planning, it's around state government planning and legislation.
Okay, so if it's all levels, why has there nothing been done? Why has no one had the political will really to shift this?
It's a very complicated problem because in housing there are always winners and losers. So yes, we want to make housing more affordable for more people, but by extension that means that housing is potentially going to go down in price for other people. And Australians hold a lot of their wealth in housing. And we know, of course, that there is an economic consequence called the wealth effect. When housing prices go down, people spend less and it actually flows through to the economy. So it's a very delicately balanced issue. And many premiers have said, I'm going to do something about this. Our own in New South Wales has said, I'm going to be the Premier for housing affordability. When we look at the drivers of what's happening, there are lots of things that can be done, but there's also a whole load of self-interest and NIMBYism, unfortunately, that means to act on this, there will be winners and there will be losers, possibly more so than in many other policy areas.
But then when you have entire generations that are losers, and when we have a housing market that's out of control, let's have a look at how expensive the housing market is really becoming here. This is a 2-bedroom house in Sydney's inner city suburb of Darlinghurst. It's a 90 square metre block. It's got a buyer's guide of $1.7 million. Safe to say it would need more than just a lick of paint to be livable. Look at this back room here. $1.7 million. How can this be sustainable? The prices going so far up, year upon year upon year, especially since the pandemic, Nikki?
Well, it's certainly not sustainable, and at some point in time, I would have thought we'd already got to that point. But what recent research tells us is that wealthy boomers are helping their kids out now. So there's this intergenerational transfer of wealth from older Australians saying, my kids can't get into the market, so 60% of first home buyers are getting support from parents or grandparents to the tune of an average $93,000. And that's, for a normal average couple on an average income, it would take them around a decade to save for the deposit. And that's the big issue. Interest rates are incredibly low. So for those already on the property merry-go-round, it's much easier to access the finance, to access the money, to then have more in investment property. So we're creating this cycle where we've got more and more of the haves concentrating with the haves, and then this group that are being shut out of the market if they don't have the lucky fortune to be born into a family that can help them out.
Alexander, there's a series of tax incentives that do place housing as an asset and not just a roof over our heads. There's been a lot of talk about this, and we're now seeing the consequences of it. Why is this not more of a political priority?
Oh, well, it's definitely a political priority. This is something the public are talking about a great deal, and I think Nikki's given a very good analysis of it. I mean, it's supply and demand, right? So first of all, there are questions about the supply, whether enough houses are being built and then being built in the right places. And there's some resistance, NIMBYism, to housing being built. And so the list goes on. Secondly, in terms, interest rates are at record lows. Which is inevitably, because people can get mortgages and relatively cheaply, it's inevitably going to push up prices. If the government provides, and the federal government does provide subsidies for people, first home buyers and so on, to buy houses, that it's all very well. The Howard government did it as well, but one of the consequences of providing subsidies for people to buy houses is that it pushes up the price of houses unless you increase the supply very rapidly, for which state and local government is responsible. So It's true, by the way, that it's a phenomenon at the moment everywhere, in the US, the UK, and so on. And that is more than any other single factor a function of the very low interest rates that we have at the moment.
And Ali, we're pointing to some horror stories in Sydney here, but it's also a boom in Brisbane. What are you noticing around you?
I think last few months the prices have certainly increased. Over some places over 10-15% in Brisbane, and new suburbs are springing out. So there was a large supply which was released by the state government a few years ago, and that supply has been gobbled up really fast. And not only that, but the prices of those suburbs, which are sometimes 25-30 minutes away from the city, are increasing. And as you guys know, that there has been some interstate migration from down south into Queensland during the COVID time, and those people are buying up houses, and most of these people are baby boomers, people who already own houses in New South Wales. They sell one house there and they end up buying 3 here in Queensland. So that reduces the supply as well.
Right, and you're also noticing it in your school? Is there more pressure on things like education and other infrastructure?
Yeah, so we have around of about total 100%, 200 kids who come to our school this year, about 25-30% have come from interstate. So, quite a lot of migrants who have settled, who were settled in New South Wales and Victoria, now deciding to move into Queensland. And part of the reason is the housing affordability, because it's relatively, comparatively cheaper than down south. But it's not going to stay that way if you don't do something about it rather soon.
Which is what's happened in Hobart, of course, because they had a flood of people have gone down there because of cheaper housing, and now Hobart is one of the most unaffordable places. It's we need to do an awful lot more on this.
Nikki, we've seen the political will in New Zealand to tackle, a very heated property market, and in terms of cracking down on investor buyers as opposed to people who just, want a roof over their heads. We talk about capital gains, we talk about negative gearing, and every time we do, it just ends in a bog. Like, what is actually going to happen here? Like, which levers will actually be pulled?
So there's some short-term things and there's some long-term things to actually properly address housing affordability without having a sort of total collapse of the market. There are things that we can do in the short term. So, getting rid of negative gearing and the capital gains tax would be one, and that will bring down prices, but modelling suggests that it won't be catastrophic. Yep. So that would be a reasonable thing to do to take some of the heat out of the market. But that's a controversial
point, isn't it? Some people say it will be...
Of course it is, because some people will lose out. And unfortunately, this is what happens when you put any policy. There's always going to be, or almost always going to be, some winners and some losers, and the losers will be very vocal. But if we just look at it, from a supply demand, as Alexander said, but we also need to look at, it's not just that, it's around the costs of housing. A lot of the costs that are driven by that supply demand and the cost of land, but it's also around government charges. I mean, how we deal with infrastructure charges, particularly in new areas, is you get slammed, whereas those of us that are fortunate enough to live in more central parts of Sydney, we had all of our infrastructure paid out of general revenue. Now, is it fair that one group who's living further away and has less amenity is actually being socked for infrastructure that the rest of us actually got for free? I think there's, regionalisation policies need to be thought through much more carefully. The latest intergenerational report from the New South Wales government, just out in the last week, says our population will be 11 million within 4 decades. So we are going to need to increase our housing or residential stock by around 50%. Now, maybe that's lower cost housing. Like, if you look at the apartment market in Sydney, there's particularly there, but other cities as well, there's been more supply come onto the market. It hasn't increased as much. And maybe there is a decision for people who live in dense cities that we need to, well, not that any Australian cities are dense, but that we need to become more dense. We might have to adopt smaller houses, but that we have lovely open spaces. And that's really, really important, is to make sure we have the open spaces.
Speaking of lovely open spaces, look, we've got Amy Coops back. We've got about 20 seconds left, and you've just bought a house. Congratulations. Tell us quickly what that was like.
Thank you. It's been terrifying, like really terrifying to be beholden to the bank, but like a great sense of freedom. I would say that like we are really feeling like the COVID pinch out here in our region, and I think it's across the board in other regions too. So housing prices have gone through the roof here, demand's gone through the roof. I've got a friend who bought only like 18 months ago. Her house is appreciated $100,000 in value. Everyone in her street now is from Melbourne. It's just people are exodusing out of Sydney and Melbourne
all we have
to
time
come
for,
here.
Right?
Yeah.
Nikki, Amy, Ali, Alexandra, thank you all so much. See you soon.